reason I didn't start with Zelda no Densetsu is because if I started with it, then I would have had to have 6 consecutive episodes with games that people weren't interested in. Or 5 episodes and one, well, I guess they had to release something nice. Anyway you slice it, the launch lineup for the Famicom Disk System was pretty good for 1986, and absolutely terrible to look back on from about 1988 onward. Except for this, the one original game that the Disk System launched with. Eventually, Zelda no Densetsu would be released as a Famicom cartridge, but that would be in 1994, after 2 sequels had been released for it, and as one of Nintendo's 2 final Famicom games. They released on the same day. This version of Zelda no Densetsu is a showcase for the Famicom Disk System's capabilities. It's the first game that we're seeing that uses both sides of the floppy, the only one of these launch titles to use wavetable synthesis for its sound, and the only one that saves any data to the disk. When I looked at this game from the perspective of 1994, it was through a lens of it shaping a large portion of the system's library. But here in 1986, this is something new. Well, kind of. Nintendo's game owes a huge debt to 3 very influential games of the time. From High Glide, it got the immersive world to explore one screen at a time. And this is High Glide for computers, not the Famicom version, which is partially based on High Glide 2, and it's a mess. Go watch my own video on that if you care. Dragon Slayer was another game with an immersive open world, with a hero who slowly powered up their stats by collecting treasure rather than fighting monsters. Those 2 games pretty much laid out the foundation for what action RPGs would be for the next few years. And Zelda no Densetsu streamlined that, pulling out all of the RPG elements, but improving the quality of the action considerably. The 3rd game's the most important of them, the one whose shadow loomed over the Japanese video game industry in the mid-80s. Druaga no To, or the Tower of Druaga. There will be a lot of Famicom games that borrow heavily from Zelda no Densetsu, but almost all of the games in 1986 and 1987 will take straight from Druaga. The key to Druaga was that in every one of the game's 60 stages, there was a power-up to collect, or sometimes a power-down. But the key to these was that there was some special method for making that item appear, and Japanese players of the early 80s became obsessed with figuring out the game. Like, arcade machines would have handwritten notes from players stuck to them, telling other players how to acquire things, and letting them fill in additional information that they might learn. And the lesson that the entire Japanese video game industry took from that was to make a good game, you packed it with obscure secrets. Zelda no Densetsu has a bit of that, but I think they learned the more important lesson from Druaga. Give the players a series of escalating items to make them feel more powerful, and give them more capabilities. The Druaga-esque secrets in Zelda no Densetsu are mainly relegated to bonuses, extra money and health for example. They're also not nearly as cruel to figure out. If you're willing to click on a video about a Famicom Disk System game, then you almost definitely know all about Nintendo's 2nd most popular franchise. But to give the quick breakdown, Princess Zelda's been kidnapped by the evil wizard Ganon. He wants her Triforce of Wisdom, a golden triangle with magical powers, and he wants it because it would look nice on his shelf next to his Triforce of Power. Now it's up to Link, who, going by the manual illustrations, is about 10 years old, to go out and kill a bunch of monsters with a sword. To face Ganon, Link first has to reassemble Zelda's Triforce, which has been broken into 8 parts and scattered among dungeons across the world. Which I guess means that the monsters in the dungeon aren't on Ganon's side? I mean, they're protecting the pieces for Zelda. As you're playing, you use A to attack with your sword, unless you're doing something really weird and trying to complete the game swordless, which can be done. And B uses whatever tool you've selected. And you can select the tools by hitting Start. Something helpful to note if you've only played the US version, there is no way to force a game over and save the game like there is in the US. When you're ready to quit, you have to run out of health, and then your progress will be saved to the floppy disk. If you're only familiar with the cartridge version, and are just seeing the Disk System version for the first time in this video, the major difference between the two are that many of the sound effects in the Disk System version uses the wavetable synthesis channel. That's a method of using very small digitized samples to create distinct sound effects. You can hear it in the sword beam, when doors open and close, when the flute is played, and how the boss monsters have unique cries. But because there is only one channel for this wavetable synthesis, these sound effects have a bad tendency to get cut off by each other. The biggest strength of Zelda no Densetsu is its massive world size. When you're walking around the Kingdom of Hyrule, there's 128 screens, 8 high, 16 wide. That is enormously larger than any of its inspirations. Hydelide was 25 screens, and Draga was 120, 60 stages that were 2 screens across. And the thing about Zelda Densetsu is that's only half the game. When you enter a dungeon, the game has to pause to load up fresh map data. Zelda no Densetsu is a big game, too. If you know where you're going and what you're doing, it takes about 2 hours to complete the game. Unless you're getting into some fancy speedrunning moves, in which case it's about half an hour, but that's still pretty big for an early 1986 vintage game. And for someone without that knowledge, well, you're going to be at it for a while. Another thing working in Zelda no Densetsu's favor is that the action is pretty good for this era. Yeah, it's basic, but clearing out a screen full of enemies gives you a reasonable challenge, especially as you get further in the game and are confronted with nastier foes. It's fun to slice and dice your way through a dungeon. Okay, maybe not the Wizrobe dungeon, but for most of the rest, it's a pretty good time. Now, the game's not perfect. Nintendo was still feeling their way through things. Some of the items that you collect don't really add a whole lot to Link's arsenal. And unless you know the special areas to go to collect money, you're going to spend a lot of the early game desperate to find cash. That'll slow somebody down as they fight the same enemies over and over again looking for more money. But a lot of this is mitigated if you have a good map. And considering using a map is more fun than burning every single tree in the game, I always recommend that people who haven't played the original Zelda no Densetsu use at least an overworld map when they play. I can keep going for a long time about Zelda no Densetsu. There's the amazing variety of enemies with distinctive patterns, the natural flow to the world design, a whole new set of dungeon maps that come with a second quest after you complete the game, the actually surprisingly decent guidance that you can find hidden throughout the world. In 1986, Zelda no Densetsu easily outdid anybody who was trying to do something similar. Nobody else blended action games and adventure exploration like this. Is it any wonder that it was a massive hit? The third best-selling game for the Famicom Disk System. It was so much of a hit that Nintendo rushed a sequel out very quickly. Link no Boken will be released 11 months later, and that means I'll be talking about it very soon. It's going to be hard to find a game on the Famicom Disk System with more historical significance than this. A genre-defining masterpiece that spawned a million imitators that are continuing to this day. And it's one that I think still plays pretty well. So many significant and influential games from the 1980s are already becoming a distant memory, but I suspect that Zelda Densetsu is going to stand the test of time. If there's still people around in 2086, and they're still able to play video games, I think that this will be a game that still has a decent following.